December 3, 1923. Providence, Rhode Island. When Detective Samuel Morrison entered the Whitmore antique shop at 47 Benefit Street, he expected to find another routine death, perhaps a heart attack, maybe a fall. What he found instead was the seventh body in 7 months, all connected to a single object, a sleek black cat with emerald eyes, posed eternally on a mahogany perch. The victim, Mrs. Eleanor Ashford, lay sprawled across the floor, her face frozen in an expression of absolute terror. Her hands were clasped around her own throat, fingernails embedded in her skin. But she hadn't been strangled. The medical examiner would later note that she appeared to have clawed at herself in her final moments, as if trying to remove something invisible that was choking her. On the shelf above her, undisturbed by the chaos below, sat the porcelain cat. Its emerald eyes seemed to catch the morning light in a way that made Detective Morrison's blood run cold. The shop owner, Mr. Whitmore, stood in the doorway, trembling. "It's the 7th, he whispered. "Every single one. Exactly 30 days. But the truth was far more terrifying than a simple curse. Before we uncover the truth about the Black Cat Curse and the deadly chain of deaths that terrorized Providence's elite in the 1920s, make sure to subscribe to The Silent Abbey and ring that notification bell so you never miss our deep dives into history's darkest mysteries. And tell us in the comments, where are you watching from tonight? We love hearing from our community of mystery seekers around the world. Now let's step back into 1923, when a seemingly innocent antique would become the center of one of America's most baffling death investigations. Providence, Rhode Island, in the early 1920s, was a city caught between two worlds. The old money families, descendants of colonial merchants and textile magnates, clung desperately to their Victorian sensibilities, even as jazz music drifted from speakeasies hidden in basement cellars, and young women bobbed their hair in defiance of tradition. The passage of Prohibition in 1920 had transformed the city's social landscape, creating a thriving underground economy and blurring the lines between respectable society and criminal enterprise. Benefit Street, known locally as the Mile of History, housed some of Providence's most prominent families in stately colonial and federal-style homes. It was a street where old names still mattered, where genealogy was currency, and where the right address could open doors that new money could never unlock. But beneath this veneer of propriety, Providence was changing. The Great War had ended just 5 years earlier, leaving behind a generation that questioned everything their parents had taken for granted. The Spanish flu pandemic of 1918 had decimated families, creating a peculiar obsession with death, spiritualism, and the supernatural that permeated even the highest levels of society. Whitmore's antique emporium sat at 47 Benefit Street, a narrow 3-story building squeezed between a Pendleton house and the First Baptist Church. Jonathan Whitmore had inherited the shop from his father in 1919, and he ran it with the quiet competence expected of a man from a respectable, if somewhat diminished, Providence family. He specialized in European imports, furniture, jewelry, art objects, catering to the collectors and social climbers who sought to furnish their homes with the prestige of old-world elegance. The porcelain cat arrived in early spring of 1923, part of a larger shipment from an estate sale in Vienna. According to Whitmore's ledgers, the collection came from the Adelstein family, Austrian nobility whose fortune had evaporated in the aftermath of the Great War. The manifest listed 1 decorative feline figurine, porcelain, circa 1880s, Vienna workshop, glass eyes, mahogany mount. In his personal diary discovered years later, Whitmore wrote, "The cat is the finest piece in the lot. Exquisite craftsmanship, though there's something unsettling about its gaze, will display prominently." What Whitmore didn't know, what none of them could have known, was that this beautiful object carried with it a history that predated its arrival in Providence by 40 years. A history written in blood and obsession in the workshops of Vienna's Josefstadt district. A history that was about to repeat itself on the cobblestone streets of New England. The cat itself was a masterwork of 19th century porcelain artistry. Approximately 14 inches tall, it sat upright in a position of aristocratic repose, one paw slightly raised as if caught mid-step. The porcelain was glazed in a deep, lustrous black that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. But it was the eyes that drew attention, genuine emeralds, cut en cabochon and set in such a way that they caught and held light with an almost living intensity. The mahogany perch on which it sat was carved with intricate Art Nouveau patterns of vines and lilies, and a small brass plate on the base bore an inscription in German, Für die Ewigkeit, for eternity. In May of 1923, the cat was merely another curiosity in a shop full of curiosities. By December, it would be evidence in a criminal investigation that would span 2 continents and expose secrets that powerful families had spent fortunes to keep buried. The first death occurred on May 15, 1923. Mrs. Constance Harrington, wife of prominent banker Theodore Harrington, purchased the cat for $175, a considerable sum, equivalent to several $1,000s today. She had been redecorating the drawing room of their Benefit Street mansion in what she called continental style, and the cat would serve as the centerpiece of her new aesthetic. According to her lady's maid, Anna Kowalski, Mrs. Harrington became immediately attached to the figurine. She talked to it, Anna would later testify. Not in a playful way, ma'am, but as if it might answer. She'd sit in the drawing room at odd hours just staring at it. Sometimes I'd hear her whispering, but when I'd enter the room she'd fall silent. Theodore Harrington dismissed these observations as nervous gossip from an overwrought servant. His wife had always been eccentric, he insisted, prone to melancholy and dramatic gestures. When friends commented on her pallor, her weight loss, her growing tendency to avoid social engagements, he attributed it to a bout of influenza that had been circulating through the city. On June 14th, exactly 30 days after the purchase, Theodore Harrington awoke to find his wife's side of the bed empty. He found her in the drawing room, seated in her favorite chair, facing the cat. She was cold to the touch, mouth open in a silent scream. The whiskey decanter beside him was empty, leading initial speculation toward alcohol poisoning. But the autopsy revealed no extraordinary amount of alcohol in his system. What it did reveal was massive hemorrhaging in his brain, a stroke of such severity that Dr. Hendricks noted, "The damage is consistent with extreme psychological distress, as if the victim experienced a terror so profound that it literally burst blood vessels in his brain." More disturbing was what the servants reported. The cook, Mrs. Davies, stated that she had heard Mr. Blackwood's voice coming from the study around 3 a.m. He was shouting, she testified, but not in English. It sounded like German, or maybe Dutch, but Mr. Blackwood didn't speak any foreign languages that I knew of. The butler, James Whitfield, noted that Mr. Blackwood had become increasingly erratic in his final week. He kept the study door locked, even during the day. He'd pace the hallways at night. Once I found him standing in the corridor outside the study, just staring at the door. When I asked if he needed assistance, he turned to me and said, "It wants something, I can feel it wanting." I assumed he meant for his business dealings, sir, but now... The cat was inherited by Mr. Blackwood's cousin, Margaret Blackwood, who thought the family hysteria over a porcelain figurine was preposterous. She was a suffragist, a college graduate from Radcliffe, a thoroughly modern woman who had no patience for supernatural nonsense. She displayed the cat in her apartment on Waterman Street, and for 3 weeks she seemed vindicated in her rationalism. Then her neighbors began to notice changes. Margaret stopped attending her suffrage meetings. Her mail piled up uncollected in the building's vestibule. When friends called, she sent them away with vague excuses. Her landlady, Mrs. Pemberton, reported hearing Margaret talking in her apartment late at night. "Full conversations," Mrs. Pemberton told police, "but there was never anyone else there. I know because I checked through the keyhole once." She was sitting on her sofa, facing the mantelpiece where she kept that damned cat, and she was nodding and responding as if someone was speaking to her. On September 10th, Margaret's colleagues from the Rhode Island Women's Suffrage Association forced their way into her apartment after she failed to appear for an important rally. They found her in the bathtub, fully clothed, drowned in 6 inches of water. Her eyes were open, staring upward. The medical examiner ruled it an accident. She had apparently fainted and fallen face first into the bath. But the women who found her told a different story. "The water was ice cold," testified Mrs. Elizabeth Morton. "The bath hadn't been drawn. There was barely any water in it at all. It was as if she had simply knelt down and put her face in the water and breathed it in deliberately. And on the bathroom floor we found scratch marks, deep gouges in the wood, as if she had tried to pull herself away but couldn't." The cat was sold by Margaret, estate executor, to a dealer in Boston, who in turn sold it to Colonel Henry Ashworth, a retired Army officer who had served in the Philippines and collected exotic objects. The colonel lasted 26 days before his housekeeper found him hanging from a beam in his library, a leather belt around his neck. His suicide note consisted of a single line, written in a shaking hand. "I can't make it stop watching." After the colonel's death, whispers began circulating through Providence's elite circles. 4 deaths, 4 owners of the same object, 4 deaths within 30 days of acquisition. The whispers reached the Providence Journal, which published a small item on page 7. "Antiques said to bring ill fortune, 4 deaths raise questions." Jonathan Whitmore, horrified by the implications for his business, purchased the cat back from Colonel Ashworth's estate for $400, determined to PR. prove that the deaths were mere coincidence. He placed it in his shop window with a placard reading, "The famous cat, superstition or science, you decide." It was a publicity stunt, he insisted, a way to draw customers curious about the morbid tale. Mr. Whitmore lasted 18 days. On October 31st, Halloween, a detail that the newspapers would seize upon with ghoulish delight. A messenger boy found Whitmore's shop locked at the unusual hour of 10 a.m. Peering through the window, the boy saw Mr. Whitmore's body slumped over his desk in the back office. Police had to break down the door to gain entry. The scene was deeply unsettling. Mr. Whitmore sat in his chair, head on his desk, surrounded by dozens of pieces of paper. On each paper, he had written the same phrase, over and over in increasingly frantic handwriting. Ich verstehe jetzt. Ich verstehe jetzt. Ich verstehe jetzt. I understand now. I understand now. I understand now. Mr. Whitmore had never studied German. The medical examiner found no obvious cause of death. His heart was healthy. His brain showed no signs of stroke or hemorrhage. His blood contained no poisons. Dr. Hendricks wrote in his report, "Subject appears to have simply ceased," as if the body decided to stop functioning in the absence of any physiological reason to do so. The cat naturally was sitting on the desk, exactly where Whitmore had placed it weeks earlier, watching. By this point, the deaths had become a sensation. The Providence Journal ran a front-page story. 5 deaths linked to cursed antique. Police investigate mysterious pattern. The article detailed each death, noting the 30-day pattern and the increasingly bizarre circumstances. Spiritualists offered their services to cleanse the object. The Catholic diocese suggested it be destroyed. Several prominent families demanded that the police confiscate and dispose of the cat immediately. But under Rhode Island law, the cat was property, and property had to be handled through proper legal channels. It was entered into evidence, then released back to Whitmore's estate. His widow, Martha Whitmore, wanted nothing to do with it. She tried to donate it to museums. All refused. She tried to sell it back to European dealers. They declined. Finally, in desperation, she approached Mrs. Eleanor Ashford, a wealthy widow known for her interest in the occult and her belief that she could communicate with objects of power. Mrs. Ashford purchased the cat for $600 on November 3, 1923. She made it exactly 30 days. If this story is giving you chills, hit that like button to help more people discover these forgotten mysteries. Share this with someone who loves dark historical tales. The investigation that followed Mrs. Ashford's death would uncover a truth that no one expected. A truth buried in the workshops of Vienna and the minds of men who believed they could create eternal life through unspeakable means. Let's discover what happens next. When Detective Samuel Morrison entered the Whitmore antique shop on that cold December morning in 1923, he was already skeptical of curses. He had served in the war, had seen men die in ways both mundane and horrific, and he had learned that death usually had prosaic explanations: disease, violence, accident, suicide. Curses were for the credulous, for society women who attended seances and collected crystals. But 7 deaths in 7 months, all connected to a single object, all occurring within exactly 30 days of acquisition. That pattern bothered him. Patterns meant something. Patterns meant human agency. Mrs. Ashford's body was removed to the morgue. The shop was sealed as a crime scene. And Detective Morrison did something that none of his predecessors had thought to do. He demanded a complete provenance of the cat. Where had it come from? Who had made it? What was its history before it arrived in Providence? The records were fragmentary, but they existed. Whitmore's purchase ledgers showed the cat had come from Vienna, part of the Adelstein estate. Morrison contacted the Austrian police through the State Department, requesting any information about the Adelstein family and their possessions. What came back 3 weeks later changed everything. The Austrian police sent a dossier compiled by the Vienna Criminal Investigation Department. The Adelstein family had indeed been prominent, until 1883, when Baroness Sophia von Adelstein was found murdered in her bedroom, strangled with her own silk scarf. The killer was never caught, but suspicion fell heavily on her husband, Baron Friedrich von Adelstein, who had become obsessed with spiritualism and the occult following the death of their daughter from tuberculosis in 1881. But it was the attached report from the Vienna workshop district that made Morrison's hands shake as he read it. In 1882, Baron von Adelstein had commissioned a series of memento mori objects from a master craftsman named Johann Fest, a porcelain artist known for his technical brilliance and his disturbing subject matter. Fest specialized in what he called Seelengefäß, soul vessels. These were porcelain figurines that, according to Fest's bizarre personal philosophy, could trap and hold human consciousness after death. The theory was grotesque. Fest believed that if a person died while intensely focused on an object, their consciousness would become bound to that object, unable to move on. He further believed that such trapped souls would seek to pull living minds into their prison, creating a kind of psychological predation. Fest claimed to have conducted experiments. Volunteers who agreed to focus on his creations in their final moments, creating what he called hungry objects. The Austrian police had investigated Fest in 1883, after several suspicious deaths among his patrons. They found his workshop filled with porcelain figures, cats, birds, human faces, each one supposedly containing a trapped soul. The workshop journals described the process in clinical detail. The victim would be drugged with a mixture of belladonna and opium, enough to induce a hypnotic state but not unconsciousness. They would be positioned facing the object, and then, through a combination of suggestion, sensory deprivation, and psychological manipulation, they would be convinced that their soul was being drawn into the porcelain. Most of these volunteers were terminal patients, paying Fest to achieve a kind of immortality through his creations. But the police investigation suggested that not all of Fest's subjects were volunteers. Several missing persons reports from Vienna's poorest districts corresponded with dates in Fest's journals. The implication was chilling. Fest was a serial killer who had discovered a way to monetize murder by convincing the wealthy that his victims' trapped souls gave the objects power. Fest disappeared in 1883, the day before police arrived with an arrest warrant. His workshop was seized, and most of his creations were destroyed, but some pieces had already been sold to private collectors, including Baron von Adelstein, who had commissioned a black cat, his deceased daughter's favorite animal, as a vessel for what Fest claimed was the soul of a young woman tragically departed. The dossier included a photograph from the Vienna police archive. Morrison held it up to the light, his heart racing. There, in grainy black and white, was an unmistakable image. A black porcelain cat with emerald eyes, sitting on an ornate mahogany perch. The same cat that now sat in the Providence police evidence room. But the most disturbing detail came in a handwritten note from the Vienna detective who had investigated the case. The Baron's wife died 28 days after he brought the cat into their home. She was found in her bedroom, strangled. The Baron claimed she had been communing with it, trying to contact their deceased daughter. He said she had become convinced that something malevolent lived inside. The porcelain. He said she tried to destroy it, but it wouldn't let her. Morrison sat in his office, the dossier spread before him, and tried to reconcile what he was reading with what he knew about the world. 7 deaths. The same method of psychological deterioration in each case. Obsession, isolation, paranoia, and then death under circumstances that were bizarre but never quite provable as homicide. 7 people, all of whom had displayed the same patterns, talking to the object, hearing it speak back, becoming convinced of its malevolence, and yet being unable to stop engaging with it. And then there was the German phrase that Mr. Whitmore had written over and over before his death. Ich verstehe jetzt. I understand now. Morrison had the phrase translated and analyzed by a professor of German at Brown University. The professor noted that the specific construction of the phrase was archaic, dating to the 1880s Austrian dialect. It was the kind of German that a Providence shopkeeper who had never studied the language would be unlikely to produce spontaneously. Unless, Morrison thought with growing horror, unless he was repeating something he had heard. Detective Morrison made a decision that would define the rest of the investigation. He ordered the cat x-rayed using the new radiography equipment at Rhode Island Hospital. The x-ray technician, Dr. Michael Chen, worked carefully, taking images from multiple angles. What they saw in those x-rays made both men step back from the viewing table. Inside the hollow porcelain body, invisible to the naked eye, was a network of thin metal wires and small glass vials. The construction was incredibly sophisticated. The wires ran from the base up through the body and into the head, where they connected to small reservoirs positioned behind the emerald eyes. The vials appeared to contain some kind of residue. It's a mechanism, Dr. Chen said, his voice hushed. Some kind of delivery system. Morrison had the cat carefully disassembled by a jeweler under police supervision. Inside, they found exactly what the x-rays had suggested. A complex system of glass capillaries and metal filaments, along with dried residue in the reservoirs. The residue was sent to a chemist at Brown University for analysis. The results came back on Christmas Eve, 1923. The residue was a mixture of several compounds, belladonna extract, ergot alkaloids, and a third substance that the chemist couldn't initially identify. Further analysis revealed it to be a derivative of bufotenin, a powerful hallucinogen derived from certain species of toads. The mixture, the chemist wrote in his report, would cause severe psychological effects including auditory and visual hallucinations, paranoia, dissociation, and possible fatal cardiac events, particularly with repeated exposure. The cat had been designed to poison its owners slowly, over the course of approximately 30 days. The mechanism was triggered by temperature changes. When the cat was moved from a cool environment like Whitmore's shop into a warm home, the heat would slowly vaporize the compounds in the reservoirs, releasing minute quantities of the toxic mixture into the air around the object. Anyone who spent time near the cat, who stared at it for hours as all the victims had, would inhale these vapors in doses too small to be immediately lethal but cumulative in their effects. The emerald eyes weren't just decorative. They were positioned directly over the reservoirs, so that when someone stared at the cat, as every victim had, they would be breathing in the highest concentration of the hallucinogenic vapors. The psychological effects would begin subtly, mild paranoia, auditory hallucinations that would sound like whispers. Over time, the victim would become convinced the cat was communicating with them. They would become obsessed, unable to look away, spending more and more time in proximity to the object, and thus inhaling more of the toxins. The final stage, occurring around the 30-day mark, would be catastrophic. The accumulated toxins would cause severe psychological breaks, cardiac distress, or, in the case of those like Mr. Whitmore, a total systemic collapse as the body simply shut down under the chemical assault. It was murder, premeditated, calculated murder by proxy, using a weapon designed to kill slowly and invisibly over the course of exactly 1 month. Johann Fest, the mad porcelain artist of Vienna, had created not a soul vessel but a poison delivery system disguised as art. And it had worked, flawlessly, for 40 years. The revelation that the cat was a sophisticated murder weapon rather than a cursed object should have simplified the investigation. Instead, it complicated everything, because now Detective Morrison faced an uncomfortable question: who was responsible for these deaths? Johann Fest, the creator, had disappeared in 1883 and was presumed dead. Baron von Adelstein, who had commissioned the cat, had died in 1897. Everyone involved in the original creation and early ownership of the object was long deceased. The recent deaths were the result of a weapon that had been set in motion decades earlier, by people who could not be brought to justice. The Providence Police Department consulted with the Attorney General's office on whether any charges could be brought. The legal questions were unprecedented. Could Jonathan Whitmore's estate be held liable for selling an object that turned out to be deadly, even though Whitmore himself had no knowledge of its true nature? Could the importers who brought the cat from Austria be charged with negligent homicide? What about the auction houses and dealers who had handled it over the years? The Attorney General, Harold Pemberton, issued a statement on January 15, 1924. While the deaths of 7 Rhode Island citizens are unquestionably tragic, the law requires that we establish criminal intent and causation. The creator of this weapon is dead. The original purchaser is dead. The subsequent owners were themselves victims. We cannot charge the dead, and we cannot prosecute those who unknowingly transmitted and inherited poison. This office finds no basis for criminal charges. The decision was deeply unpopular. The families of the victims demanded accountability. Mrs. Martha Whitmore, widow of Jonathan Whitmore, filed a civil lawsuit against the Austrian government, arguing that they should have destroyed all of Johann Fest's creations in 1883, and that their failure to do so constituted negligence. The suit was dismissed on grounds of sovereign immunity and the statute of limitations. Theodore Harrington, widower of the first victim, sued Whitmore's estate for $50,000, arguing that Whitmore had a duty to investigate the provenance of dangerous objects before selling them. The case went to trial in May 1924 and became a sensation. The defense argued that Whitmore could not reasonably have been expected to X-ray and chemically analyze every antique in his shop. The prosecution countered that after the first 3 deaths created a clear pattern, Whitmore should have withdrawn the cat from circulation rather than purchasing it back and attempting to profit from its notoriety. The jury deliberated for 6 days. They returned a verdict in favor of the plaintiff but awarded only $5,000 in damages, finding Whitmore's estate partially but not primarily liable. It was a compromise verdict that satisfied no one. The broader investigation into Johann Fest's other creations became an international effort. Detective Morrison worked with Interpol and police departments across Europe to track down other pieces from Fest's workshop. Over the next 2 years, they identified 17 objects that had been sold to various collectors between 1880 and 1883. Most had disappeared into private collections or been destroyed, but they found 4 others: a porcelain dove in Munich, a chess set in Paris, a music box in London, and a portrait bust in New York. Each one was examined. Each one contained similar mechanisms, reservoirs of toxic compounds designed to slowly poison anyone who spent extended time with the object. The Munich dove had claimed 3 lives between 1891 and 1920. The Paris chess set had killed its owner and 2 of his friends during a tournament in 1905. The London music box had been responsible for the deaths of a mother and 2 children in 1898, a case that had been attributed to household gas poisoning. The New York bust had sat in a museum storage room for 30 years, never displayed, and had harmed no one. All of these objects were destroyed under controlled conditions by hazmat teams, a very new concept in the 1920s. The destruction of the Providence Cat was documented by newsreel cameras and became a widely circulated film, shown in theaters across America as an example of scientific justice defeating ancient evil. But the psychological aftermath was harder to address. The case had been widely publicized, and it triggered a wave of anxiety about antiques, imported goods, and objects with unclear provenance. Antique dealers across New England reported a collapse in business as potential buyers worried that any old object might contain hidden poisons or curses. The Providence Chamber of Commerce estimated that the scandal cost the city's antique trade over $2 million in lost revenue between 1924 and 1926. The 7 families affected by the deaths formed an advocacy group called the Alliance for Consumer Protection, which lobbied for new laws requiring importers to document the provenance and composition of antique objects. Their efforts contributed to the passage of the Federal Antiques Disclosure Act of 1927, which required dealers to provide written histories of any imported object over 50 years old and valued at more than 100. Several of the victims' families never recovered from their losses. Theodore Harrington sold his Benefit Street mansion and moved to California, unable to bear living in the house where his wife had died. The Blackwood family scattered. Andrew's widow moved to Boston, and his children were sent to boarding schools in New York and Connecticut. Margaret Blackwood's colleagues in the suffrage movement dedicated their successful campaign for full voting rights to her memory, saying that she had died in the fight for women's autonomy over their own safety. Eleanor Ashford's case was particularly poignant. Her children, both adults, revealed in interviews with the Providence Journal that their mother had purchased the cat specifically because she believed she could protect others from it. She had been a practicing occultist who believed that certain people had the spiritual strength to contain malevolent forces. She thought she could succeed where others had failed. Her children established a scholarship in her name at Brown University for students studying psychology and the intersection of belief systems and mental health, a field that was just beginning to develop in the 1920s. Detective Morrison himself was deeply affected by the case. In his memoirs, published in 1954, he wrote, "The cat taught me that evil is not always a person. Sometimes evil is a legacy, a malevolence encoded into an object by someone long dead, waiting patiently to fulfill the dark purpose for which it was created." Johann Fest died in obscurity somewhere in Europe, but his murders continued for 4 decades after his disappearance. That's a kind of immortality, though not the kind he claimed to be creating. He proved that you can kill from beyond the grave, if you're clever enough and evil enough. That realization changed how I saw my job. I began looking for patterns in old cases, for deaths that seemed disconnected but might be threads in a larger tapestry of violence. The cat was not a curse, but it was something worse, proof that human malice can be embedded into the physical world waiting for the right conditions to activate. The Providence Police Department created a new division in 1925 called the Historical Crimes Unit, tasked with investigating deaths that might be connected to antique objects, heirlooms, or historical artifacts. It was the first unit of its kind in the United States. Morrison was promoted to captain and put in charge of it. Over the next 15 years, his unit investigated 73 cases of suspicious deaths linked to old objects. They found 3 other instances of deliberately poisoned antiques, plus numerous cases of accidental poisoning from objects containing lead paint, arsenic-based pigments, or mercury compounds that had been commonly used in manufacturing before their dangers were understood. The Vienna connection was never fully resolved. The Austrian police conducted a posthumous investigation into Johann Fest's activities, and estimated that his soul vessels had killed at least 43 people between 1880 and 1924, making him one of the most prolific serial killers in European history despite having been dead for most of that period. They discovered that Fest had been a medical student before becoming a porcelain artist, and had studied toxicology extensively. His workshop journals, partially recovered from a storage facility in Vienna in 1926, revealed that he had conducted systematic experiments on homeless people and institutionalized mental patients, testing different combinations of toxins and delivery methods. The journals also revealed Fest's motivation, which was neither mystical nor financial. He was a sadistic personality who had discovered that he could commit murder with virtual impunity by creating weapons that killed long after they left his hands. He enjoyed the idea that his victims would go mad slowly, that they would be unable to escape the trap he had set for them, and that their deaths would appear natural or accidental. He had even documented his technique for creating the psychological dependency that made victims unable to destroy or abandon the objects. The early doses of toxins included mild euphoria-inducing compounds that made the victims associate the object with pleasure, followed by increasing doses of anxiety-inducing compounds that made them feel safe only in the object's presence. It was psychological manipulation via chemistry, decades before such techniques would be formally studied by science. Johann Fest had essentially invented a method of remote control murder, and he had gotten away with it for his entire life and beyond. The case also exposed uncomfortable truths about the antique trade. Investigators found that many dealers, while not knowing about specific poisoning mechanisms, were well aware that certain objects had bad reputations, and would deliberately withhold this information from buyers to facilitate sales. Jonathan Whitmore's correspondence with other dealers, recovered from his estate, showed that he had been warned by a colleague in Boston that the Viennese cat has a history of bad luck, but had dismissed this as superstition. The trade had operated on a principle of caveat emptor, buyer beware, that the 7 deaths had proven was inadequate for public safety. The Providence Cat Case, as it came to be known in legal circles, was cited in 53 subsequent court cases between 1925 and 1950, establishing precedents about liability for inherited danger, the responsibility of dealers to investigate their inventory, and the limits of the supernatural defense in criminal law. It helped establish the legal principle that while curses might not exist, cursed objects deliberately designed to harm their owners, definitely did, and the law needed to account for them. The Providence Cat Case marked a turning point in how American society understood the intersection of history, commerce, and public safety. It revealed that the past was not always benign, that objects carried not just memories but sometimes deadly legacies, and that the antique trade, it operated largely unregulated since colonial times, needed oversight and accountability. The Federal Antiques Disclosure Act of 1927 was the most immediate legislative impact. The law required dealers to maintain records of provenance for any imported object over 50 years old and valued at more than 100. Dealers had to disclose any known history of ownership by individuals involved in criminal activity, and objects connected to murders or suspicious deaths had to be registered with federal authorities. The act also established penalties for dealers who knowingly sold objects that had been used in crimes, without disclosing this history to buyers. The law was controversial. Antique dealers argued that it was impossible to research the complete history of every object, especially those imported from countries with incomplete records or those that had changed hands multiple times over generations. Civil libertarians worried about the creation of a federal registry of cursed objects, which seemed to give government sanction to superstition. But proponents, including families of the Providence victims, argued that basic transparency in commerce was not an unreasonable demand, and that buyers had a right to know if they were purchasing an object with a violent history. The law survived court challenges and remained in effect, though it was amended several times, most significantly in 1947, when the value threshold was raised to $500 to account for inflation, and again in 1983, when computer databases made record-keeping much easier, and the requirements were expanded to include domestic antiques, not just imports. The case also accelerated the development of forensic science. The techniques used to analyze the Providence cat, X-ray imaging of solid objects, chemical analysis of minute residues, cross-referencing international police records, became standard practice in police investigations. Detective Morrison's Historical Crimes Unit became a model for similar units established in Boston, New York, Philadelphia, and Chicago. These units solved hundreds of cold cases by applying modern forensic techniques to old evidence and by recognizing patterns that spanned years or decades. The intersection of psychology and toxicology became a recognized field of study partly because of the Providence case. Researchers at universities across the country began studying how chemical substances could be used to manipulate behavior, predict psychological responses to different compounds, and understand the relationship between suggestion and chemical influence. This research would eventually contribute to the development of psychopharmacology as a medical discipline, though it would also have darker applications in government programs exploring mind control and chemical warfare. The case had cultural impacts that extended far beyond law and science. It became a popular subject for writers, and dozens of novels, short stories, and plays were produced in the 1930s and 1940s that used poisoned antiques as plot devices. The most famous was Harriet Prescott's 1932 novel, The Viennese Legacy, which won the Pulitzer Prize and was adapted into a successful Broadway play. These fictional treatments kept the story alive in public consciousness and reinforced the idea that beautiful objects could contain hidden malevolence. The case also influenced the emerging field of consumer protection, the principle that sellers had an obligation to know what they were selling and to disclose risks to buyers gained traction across multiple industries beyond antiques. The Federal Trade Commission, established in 1914, expanded its mandate in the 1930s partly in response to cases like the Providence Cat, taking a more active role in preventing deceptive practices and requiring disclosure of product hazards. Religious and occult communities responded to the case in varied ways. Some spiritualists argued that the case proved the existence of malevolent supernatural forces, despite the scientific explanation for the deaths. Others saw it as validation of their warnings about the dangers of objects connected to violent deaths or dark intentions. The Catholic Church used the case in training materials for priests, teaching them to distinguish between actual poisoning and perceived supernatural influence when dealing with parishioners who believed they were cursed. The psychological impact on how people related to possessions, particularly old possessions, was profound and lasting. The case contributed to a broader cultural anxiety about the past and its intrusion into modern life, an anxiety that was already present in the 1920s as Americans navigated the tensions between tradition and modernity, between Old World heritage and New World identity. The idea that Grandma's heirloom might be literally poisonous became a metaphor for the toxic legacies that families and societies carry forward from generation to generation. Interestingly, the case also influenced estate and probate law. Several states passed legislation in the late 1920s and early 1930s requiring executors to conduct safety inspections of estate property before distributing it to heirs or selling it at auction. This was partly in response to the Providence Cat, which had been transmitted through estate sales multiple times without anyone questioning whether it was safe. These laws established the principle that an estate could be held liable for distributing property that was later discovered to be dangerous, even if the deceased owner had been unaware of the danger. The case raised philosophical questions that persist to this day. What is our responsibility for the consequences of objects we create or own? Can an object be evil, or is evil always a quality of human intention? At what point does a historical artifact become a public safety hazard? These questions have relevance beyond antique poisonings. They apply to everything from Confederate monuments to contaminated industrial sites to nuclear waste that will remain dangerous for thousands of years. In Providence itself, the case became a defining chapter in the city's history. Benefit Street, once the most prestigious address in Rhode Island, acquired a slightly sinister reputation that persisted for decades. Property values on the street declined in the 1920s and 1930s, and several of the grand old houses were subdivided into apartments or sold to institutions. It wasn't until the 1950s that the street's historical significance was re-emphasized, and preservation efforts began to restore its reputation. The Whitmore Antique Emporium never reopened. The building at 47 Benefit Street was sold and became a bookshop, then a tea room, and finally a private residence. A small brass plaque was installed on the facade in 1973, the 50th anniversary of the deaths, reading simply, "In memory of the 7 souls lost to the Providence Cat, 1923. May their tragedy remind us that beauty can conceal danger, and that vigilance is the price of safety." The 7 victims became a strange kind of local legend, cautionary tales told to children about the importance of asking questions and being wary of things too beautiful to be trusted. Teachers used the story to discuss critical thinking and the scientific method. Tour guides on Providence historical walks included the site as a stop, though they usually emphasized the detective work that solved the case, rather than the supernatural elements that had initially captivated the public. Perhaps the most lasting impact was the lesson that evil is patient. Johann Fest's murders continued long after his death because he had encoded his malice into objects that would outlast him. He had created legacies of suffering that would unfold automatically, requiring no further action on his part. In doing so, he demonstrated a terrible truth, that violence can be inherited, transmitted across generations, embedded in the very things we treasure and pass down to our children. This realization has uncomfortable applications beyond poisoned antiques. It applies to environmental contamination, to cycles of abuse and trauma, to institutional injustices encoded into laws and practices that persist long after their creators are dead. The Providence Cat is a literal example of a more general phenomenon, the way past evils continue to claim victims in the present, and how dismantling these inherited dangers requires recognition, investigation, and decisive action. The case file remains open at the Providence Police Department, though no active investigation continues. The last entry, dated December 3, 2023, exactly 100 years after the final death, reads, "Case reviewed on Centennial. All known artifacts destroyed. No further deaths attributed to Fest objects since 1924. Case remains open as reminder. Vigilance is eternal." So what do you think? Was Johann Fest a genius who discovered a way to commit perfect murders, or was he simply a sadistic killer who got lucky with chemistry? And what responsibility do we have to investigate the histories of the objects we bring into our homes, especially in an age when antiques from all over the world are just a click away? Leave your theories in the comments below. Would you have kept the cat even after hearing the stories? Do you think there are other Fest objects still out there, waiting to claim more victims? If this story captivated you, make sure you're subscribed to the Silent Abbey so you never miss our investigations into history's darkest mysteries. Hit that notification bell, and you'll be the first to know when we uncover the next lost chapter of American history. Next week, we're investigating the sanatorium scandal of 1931, when a tuberculosis hospital in the Adirondacks was discovered to be conducting unauthorized experiments on dying patients. You won't want to miss it. Until then, stay curious, stay skeptical, and maybe think twice before you buy that beautiful antique from an estate sale with no provenance. See you in the next video.